I hope you're doing well today. Appreciate you joining me. In today's study, we're going to be thinking about the 400 years of silence in between the Old Testament's conclusion and, of course, the announcement of John the Baptist and Jesus and their birth and such things as that. You got 400 years there, and things happen. And one of the ways you know that things are happening is by what shows up in the New Testament that's not there in the Old Testament. Anyway, today's hymn is the hymn, Now the Day is Over.
Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening still across the sky. When the morning wakens, then may I arise, pure and fresh and sinless, in thy holy eyes.
Appreciate it, Lee. I was not familiar with that hymn. To look at one of the passages to consider, Matthew chapter 5 at verse 20. Says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, they did have scribes in the Old Testament. Ezra, you might think about him, those who were dedicated to such things as the dedicated to the law. Would you call him a scribe? Expert in the law. He dedicated himself to knowing the law. But who you don't see in the Old Testament are the Pharisees. So they originated, you would have to say they originated in that 400 years of silence. You don't see the Pharisees, you don't see the Sadducees, you don't see the Herodians, you don't see the Zealots, things along those lines. What you have is what was happening was Judaism was fracturing. And while those who came back from captivity were to be preparing for the Messiah, and many of them did, but at the same time, things are not what they should be, which is why when John the Baptist comes on the scene, one of his roles is to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. Can't remember if it's fathers to the children, children to the fathers, but it's this picture of things are not what they needed to be. The mountains needed to be brought down, the valleys needed to be brought up. There's a reason that so many in Israel were disenfranchised. Right? That's what was happening. So you don't see those fractures in the Old Testament like that. When the captives come back, they're working together and such things as that. But things were fracturing. That's the first thing. The second verse I would like to look at is in Luke. In Luke chapter 4 at verse 14. It says, "Then Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee. He taught in their synagogues, being glorified. He comes to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." You do not read about the synagogues in the Old Testament. And so these synagogues that are being built, you might think about how important of a role they are going to play, because not everybody comes back to Israel. Only the remnant comes back to Israel. There's Jews scattered all over the place. That's why when the word starts spreading and when Paul starts going to different places, one of the first things he does is he goes to the synagogues, because there were Jews who would have been familiar with the law, and he's going to start, right, looking at that low-lying fruit. It's like these people are the ones who should have been prepared for the Messiah. So he goes into the synagogues in all these places. You do not see those synagogues in the Old Testament, but you do in the New Testament. We know what they're going to be used for. In James, in the first couple of chapters in James, when it talks about if a rich man comes into your assembly, that word there, it's going to be the word for synagogue. Literally, it's a coming together place. And so as Jews were scattered throughout Israel, they would come into the synagogue, And by the way, you might notice Jesus, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue. This is what they would do on the Sabbath. They went to synagogue. That wasn't commanded in the old law. They were just commanded to keep the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath, and keep it holy. But then there's a fly flying around in here. Pardon me if you end up seeing it at some point. You do not see synagogues in the Old Testament. So just think about how important that is. Something else you do not see in the Old Testament is in Matthew, and I was just thinking about any passage that would illustrate the time we are in. Matthew 22, verse 19, when they were asking about the taxes, and he says, whose inscription is this? Caesar's. And he says, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. It's the time of the Roman Empire. You don't see the Roman Empire in the Old Testament. And actually, another kingdom has risen and fallen. The Greeks have come and gone. Well, I say come and gone, but actually, and concerning the prophecy made in Daniel, Rome adapted the mixing, as it is, mixing of the different materials. Rome adapted or adopted many Greek practices and cultures and things like that. But it was going to be in the time of the Roman Empire that the Lord is going to build his kingdom. So now it's the right time. All this is why people, those who were faithful and those who understood these things, they were looking for it. Right? It's the right time. Prophecies had been made, and one of those prophecies concerned Rome. So you might just think about each one of these things. In the 400 years of silence, other things happened. For example, the Maccabean revolt. That happened. If you've heard of such things, that's one reason the temple was, once again, there was the temple suffered a lot of destruction. The rebuilt temple suffered a lot of destruction and things like that. That's why when Jesus comes on the scene, the temple with Herod, by the way, you don't read about the Herods in the Old Testament. The Herod the Great, and you have the building that was going on with the temple there that's referenced. You also don't see really, that I can think of, the unclean spirits in the Old Testament. That when Jesus comes on scene, that it looks like that was, the unclean spirits were allowed to do what they were doing to manifest God's glory. That you had those who had power over the unclean spirits. The Lord, of course, as he casts out the unclean spirits, showing that. You have this 400 years of silence, and you see what the condition of the New Testament, what's happening in the New Testament, and you realize, ooh, things had been happening. So back to our first point, the Pharisees, Sadducees. The Pharisees, the separatists. Here were people who were adamant about, the whole point was they wanted to keep the law, most of them, not all of them, but most of them. The Saul of Tarsus's, the Nicodemuses, the Joseph of Arimathea's, they wanted to keep the law. Problem was they were starting to incorporate things or starting to do things to help them keep the law, namely their traditions. And they're starting to write that they've written their traditions down. And then you have to have writings to explain the traditions. And they're elevating traditions. And so you have these people who have the right idea, do what the Lord wants you to do. But now they're elevating the elders' traditions over the Word of God. And so things are breaking down. All of those things are happening in the 400 years of silence, and I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about. We could talk about a lot of stuff with Rome, and the Pax Romani, the Roman peace, the Roman roads, right? All the infrastructure and how that infrastructure is going to be used to spread the gospel. We can talk about all sorts of stuff. A lot of things happen. 400 years, long time. But tomorrow we get to John the Baptist, Jesus, and we're moving on. Appreciate you. Hope you have a good day. Join us tomorrow for another portion of our Daily Praise.